A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I never thought a jar of salsa could change the course of my life, but here we are, staring at the shattered pieces of our relationship scattered across the floor like the remnants of my sanity. It started innocently enough. I had recently moved in with my boyfriend, Greg, after a whirlwind romance sparked during the summer, ignited by endless nights and passion that made us feel invincible. We'd lit up the apartment with laughter and playfulness, and my heart danced to the rhythm of our shared routines, except for one glaring issue that simmered beneath the surface: my obsession with cooking, specifically, spicy, fresh salsa, which I made in massive batches and stored in a shelf in our shared kitchen. Greg could never understand my fascination. To him, food was just fuel, a means to an end, whereas for me, it was an art form, and with every batch of salsa, I poured my heart, my energy, my joy into those jars, experimenting with flavors that mirror the slightly chaotic, yet vibrant, corners of my soul. One evening, as I prepared yet another batch, I discovered the last jar of my homemade salsa missing, an inconvenience that morphed into utter frustration when I found Greg lethargically dipping tortilla chips into the jar, the very jar I had made with organic tomatoes and spices sourced from the farmer's market, garnished lovingly with cilantro from our balcony garden. My inner chef exploded into outrage. Salsa was not just a condiment, it was my philosophy, a piece of me shared with everyone, and here he was, recklessly scarfing it down like it was nothing more than a cheap store-bought dip. I confronted him, my voice a mix of hurt and fury, demanding to know if he hadn't thought to ask me first. Greg shrugged it off, that infuriating indifference washing over him, claiming he didn't think it was a big deal and that he was hungry, which twisted the knife deeper. What started as a simple disagreement spiraled into a full-blown argument, with me feeling unvalued and him unable to fathom why I was making such a big deal over salsa. As I tried to explain that it wasn't just about the salsa, it was about respect, the connection and love I felt when crafting something unique, he just rolled his eyes, as if dismissing my feelings, sealing the rift between us. The argument escalated, voices raised and words flung like daggers until both of us were left panting, standing defiantly on each side of the kitchen. I threw my apron on the floor, crying out in frustration, and in a moment of irrational clarity, I announced that I was done with this relationship, with the dismissive attitude towards my passions, with him and his thoughtlessness. I grabbed a few essentials, acting on instinct instead of reason, and stormed out, leaving behind the shattered pieces of our relationship. I crashed at my friend Sarah's place, feeling raw and vulnerable, and while I confided in her about the ridiculousness of it all, she encouraged me to take a moment to evaluate what really mattered. Days turned into a week, and every time I thought of reaching out, my mind spiraled into confusion over how something so trivial had led to my walking out, until the truth hit me: it wasn't really about the salsa. The salsa was just the final drop in a bucket that had been overflowing for months. It revealed the lack of respect for my boundaries, my passions, and my individuality. I envisioned the countless moments I felt dismissed or trivialized in our relationship over minor squabbles, and how this one incident had catalyzed all my pent-up frustrations into a burst of courage to leave. Just when I thought I was finding clarity, I received a slew of messages from Greg, alternating between apologies, anger, and confusion, a chaotic reflection of our tumultuous connection. I sat in Sarah's living room, reading his words with mounting dread as he expressed disbelief, wondering if I was truly going to end it all over something so trivial. I found my heart clenching at his cries for understanding, but every time I returned to the memory of him shoveling my hard work carelessly, I felt my resolve strengthen. A few days later, I decided to respond, feeling almost guilty as if I was betraying a love that once brought me joy. I crafted a long message explaining that it wasn't about the salsa, but rather a culmination of feelings I'd suppressed, feelings I couldn't ignore any longer. I wanted him to understand how it felt to be belittled, the way he had turned something I held dear into something unworthy of his respect. I hit send, my heart racing as I waited for his response, and it felt like watching our entire relationship teeter on the edge of a knife. Hours later, I received a defense that stung, filled with blame instead of understanding. "You overreacted," he said. "People argue over bigger things." I felt crushed, the weight of his dismissal crashing down on me, hitting home in a way that made it clear I would never change him. I took a deep breath, realizing I had dodged a bullet. A few weeks passed with me immersed in self-discovery, painting canvases that reflected my feelings, experimenting with bold flavors that mirrored who I had forgotten I was, a vibrant, passionate soul. I poured my energy into salsa, not just the kind in jars but salsa for my life, reclaiming my identity piece by piece. Days turned into months, and eventually, I found a new place, one with sunlight streaming in through large windows, where I could create without fear of imposition. As I made a fresh batch of spicy salsa, I smiled, feeling the warmth of what I had lost transforming into the nourishment of what I had gained, the assurance that I wouldn't settle. I craved a relationship built on mutual respect, not over a jar of salsa, but everything it represented. However, as I turned to pour the fresh batch into a new jar, a shiver crawled down my spine when I heard a distinct knock at my door. I froze, feeling the heartbeat of fear as realization dawned that I knew that knock. I approached slowly, every instinct screaming at me to turn away and not look back. But curiosity, laced with adrenaline, took the reins, and I opened the door, only to find Greg standing there, a broken look on his face mixed with a sparkle of recognition as he held out a familiar jar. My heart skipped. It was my salsa jar, the same one he had shamelessly consumed from that night. He paused, searching for words, and I felt the rush of panic flood back. Was he here to pick up where we had left off, or to drag me back into that place of pain? Before I could ask, he simply said, "I'm sorry," and at that moment, I knew, salsa may have been the reason I left, but it wasn't powerful enough to drag me back in again. Seeing the jar in hand, so full of vibrant life, suddenly felt like an impossible choice to make. Would I allow an old wound to reopen, or trust the flavor of newfound freedom? I shut the door firmly, knowing I was finally free to create my own destiny, however spicy it may be. When I first started working as a hospital janitor right out of high school, I had no idea how low my paycheck would be compared to the horrifying sacrifices I would eventually make. I remember the first day vividly. The fluorescent lights flickered above as I donned my oversized uniform, a scent of sterile cleaning agents swirling in the air, and the echo of distant beeping machines punctuating the silence. Nurses and doctors passed by incessantly, faces masked in concentrated determination, oblivious to the scruffy figure behind them. It didn't take long for me to understand that the job was more than just mopping floors and emptying bins. Instead, it was an endless loop of exposure to the dark, unnerving realities hidden beneath the sterile facade of the hospital. As weeks turned to months, I became entangled in the hushed whispers of the patients, stories I couldn't unhear despite how hard I tried. The cries of the dying seeped through the walls, telling tales of despair and lost chances. I recall one chilling night shift when I heard a woman sobbing in room 303, a soft, broken sound grinding against the starkness of the operating room, announcements constantly echoing. My curiosity eventually pulled me closer to her plight. Later, I found out her name was Claire, suffering from terminal cancer. And while I was tasked with simply cleaning her room, I began to listen to her stories of love, regret, and pain as each night I returned to scrub the gleaming floors of her brave, fragile existence. Then one fateful night, I entered her room to find it eerily silent, the bed empty, the sheets freshly laundered, and the shadows deepening in the corners as if they were conspiring to steal her soul. I felt unsettled, yet a sense of duty compelled me to keep cleaning, even as I sensed a heaviness in the air. An electromagnetic pulse of sorrow radiating from the room. Just as I pushed the mop through streaks of disinfectant, I heard a soft whisper, "Help me." It stopped me cold. I scanned the room, my heart pounding wildly, only to discover the chilling connection with the chair in the corner, a woman, pale as death, dressed in what looked like a hospital gown, her face as hollow as the memories she carried. "Help me find my son," she implored, her voice like autumn wind rustling through dead leaves. I glanced back at the door, paralyzed by both fear and sympathy. The clock ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching infinitely. I didn't know what to do, duty and dread battling within me like thunderous storms, but the look in her eyes compelled me, something primal weaving around my heart. I answered her with a hesitant nod, and it was then she smiled, a fractured thing, before fading like smoke into the darkness. In the subsequent weeks, the haunting whispers persisted. Claire's story morphed into something all-consuming as I scoured the hospital for signs of her son, but all I unraveled were more lost souls, tragic narratives entwined with every corner I cleaned. Each day, I grew more exhausted, not just physically, but psychologically. My fellow janitors joked about our conditions, the long hours, paltry wages, and the shadows that seemed to surround us. They shrugged it off, but I knew we bore secrets buried beneath the dirty linoleum and sterile tiles. Secrets that demanded acknowledgement. The admin was tight-lipped about the realms we navigated, and though I considered reporting the overwhelming sensations, the hushed dismissals made me second-guess. But I pressed on, feeling the weight of those who had drifted into the night, their stories shifting into mine. Searching resulted in dark, endless nights. A particularly haunting corridor would open into room 305, where another tormented soul lay, and I promised I'd help him too. Some nights began to blend into the next as the dying pleas throbbed in my ears like echoes bouncing off time. Time lost its meaning, and the meager paycheck only deepened my discontent. I had no formal training, just a mop and a hazy resolve to unearth the unworldly connections that tethered these spirits in pain. Then one morning, just as I was finishing a shift, Claire's silhouette danced before me again, a flicker in the farthest corner of my vision. My heart raced, her son, as though she had linked our souls in an eternal prayer. "You're too late," she whispered breathlessly. Too late to help him. Frantic, I darted down the corridor, a battle cry of urgency exploding in my chest. Every heartbeat pounded in rhythm with each labored step toward room 305, but the thick dread clawing at my gut felt insurmountable. Just as I arrived, I found the door ajar, the familiar chilled air almost welcoming me as I stepped closer. Shadows flickered against the walls like ominous warnings. But the room was empty, a haunting silence hanging in the air like forgotten dreams. Succumbing to a moment's weakness, I sank to my knees, the magnitude of failure pressing down on my shoulders like a shroud, and it was then I heard her voice again, now sharper, like glass cutting through fog. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun to face the source. The last thing I expected was to find the ghostly visage of Claire materializing like dark mist, a hollow echo of her former self, and I realized, the boy had never existed. I had been drawn into a web of sorrow, helplessly ensnared by the unending cycle of despair. As darkness enveloped me, the cold, clammy air pinched at my skin, her presence disappearing before I could plead for understanding. I shot back into consciousness, the whispers now relentless and maddening, and I quit that night, vowing never to return, resigned to the fact that my meager pay wasn't enough for the souls I had failed. But as weeks rolled by and I sought new work, I still felt their presence, the keen gaze of wandering eyes trailing me, forever searching for solace. Making just enough to scrape by felt like another loss, and gradually my soul chipped away, a reminder of the grim price for such an unappreciated role in life's theater. And now, as I tell my truth to you, I brace for the waking nightmare where the souls of the forgotten reach out with cold fingers, the weight of their stories compressing my heart as it beats like a drum only I can hear, wrapped in the pain of the one thing no amount of money can ever rectify, listening too deeply to the dangers of their ceaseless longing. As I stepped into my small clinic for another long day, the familiar sounds of the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead filled the air, but today felt different. There was an unmistakable tension coiling in my gut, even as I glanced through my schedule and saw a new patient listed under the mysterious name St. Michael. My mind chuckled ironically at the coincidence, dismissing it as a quirky name like so many others I'd encountered, until I met him. When he walked through the door, he radiated an uncanny glow. It was almost as if the shadows dared not touch him, and the very air around him seemed to shimmer with a warmth that disarmed me instantly. He smiled, and there was something in his eyes, a depth that felt overwhelming, as if he'd lived 1,000 lifetimes. My skepticism faded as he took a seat, and with each seemingly simple question he answered, I saw traces of profound wisdom that belied his age. As I went through the motions of taking his medical history, I felt an odd sense of euphoria wash over me. He shared stories of helping the homeless, volunteering at shelters, sometimes reaching into his own pockets to feed hungry children. It was also admirable that it almost felt surreal. This was no ordinary patient. But as the session progressed, I started noticing things that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. In between transitions from his past achievements, each time I looked away, I'd hear whispers echoing around the room, soft and ethereal, just beyond the realm of comprehension, like the sighs of distant souls begging for release. I tried to shake it off, attributing it to fatigue, but the whispers grew louder with every word he spoke, entwining themselves with his tales of kindness until I could no longer distinguish reality from imagination. One particular point made me fixate on him even more. He casually mentioned a tragic car accident, the details creeping into my mind like shadows reaching out to drag me into a deeper abyss. "It's not the hardware you lose that matters, it's the souls you carry," he said, his voice oddly comforting, yet those words chilled me to the bone. Suddenly, the playful skepticism I had felt transformed into a foreboding dread, especially when I realized I had forgotten to adhere to HIPAA regulations. I found myself sharing poignant details of my own life, my struggles with addiction and loneliness, and when I finished, his gaze felt disturbingly penetrating. He nodded knowingly, like a listener from beyond the grave, and I could feel an insatiable urge to unearth more truths from him, as if he was the key to unraveling a hidden part of myself. Day after day, our sessions continued. Each time he arrived, the glow around him brightened, contrasting with my growing darkness, a fact that became more apparent when I started finding little tokens left behind after his visits. A feather now perched on my desk, a vibrant flower on the floor where he sat, and even a handwritten note left under my coffee mug, all bearing simple but profound wisdom. I found myself obsessively searching online about the phenomena of halos and blinding lights, convinced that he could be something otherworldly, maybe even an angel sent to guide lost souls like mine, but I was also deeply disturbed. Why would an angel need a healthcare provider, and more critically, why did he need me? One evening, bolstered by sinking confessions to my therapist who took pity on my fragile mind, I decided to confront this Saint Michael about what I felt. A mental health professional second-guessing his own sanity was already dangerous, and I dreaded the potential fallout if I went rogue. I waited in my office, heart pounding like a war drum, ultimately drawing courage from the shadows of the very room I wished to escape. The door creaked open, and a figure emerged with a soft light radiating all around, but as he stepped closer, what I saw sent me reeling. His face was the definition of serenity, yet the deeper I gazed, the more I recognized the eyes that stared back at me. They were the same eyes of every patient I lost, their haunting memories melting together into a grotesque tapestry of guilt clinging to my conscience. My hands began to shake as the whispers crescendoed into a cacophony, pleading for acknowledgement, yelling for justice, and in that moment, I knew, I wasn't treating a saint, I was confronting my demons personified in tailored scrubs, a vehicle for all the grief I thought I had buried under layers of self-preservation. And when I caught myself asking why he had come, I was met with a simple truth. He was there to collect what was owed, all the lives I hadn't saved, all the eyes that had searched mine for answers that no doctor could provide. His voice dripped with an unearthly calmness, sending shivers down my spine as he spoke his final words. You cannot save what you've never recognized, the sin is in forgetting. In a fraction of a moment, the shadows became a thick haze, wrapping tightly around me, and I realized I was no longer in control. Saint Michael may have been a healer, but he was also a harbinger, here to remind me that in the medical profession, the weight of a single soul lost is heavier than all the halos in the world, and as I screamed silently, the only thing that remained was the echoes of the ones I couldn't save, trapped eternally in a limbo where hope and despair endlessly intertwine. I never thought an ultrasound photo could spark so much chaos and uncover deeply buried secrets, but here I am, regretting the day I trusted family to keep their boundaries. It all started when I decided to visit my parents in their cozy suburban home for a weekend. I was a few months pregnant, and this was the first grandchild on its way, so I knew they'd be thrilled when I shared the news. Over tea and laughter, I handed them the ultrasound images, expecting happy tears and maybe some celebratory snacks. They were ecstatic, embracing me with pure joy in their eyes. It was one of those rare moments I felt close to them. However, I insisted on keeping the pregnancy news private for just a while longer, wanting to share it on my own terms. They agreed, insisting they'd respect our wishes, and I left that weekend with a heart full of optimism. 3 weeks later, as Christmas approached, I received a peculiar email from an aunt I barely spoke to, cluttered with emojis in typical her fashion, exclaiming how adorable the announcement was, and wondering why I hadn't told her personally. Baffled, I replied asking what she meant, and she soon sent back a picture that made my heart drop. It was an elaborately designed Christmas card with the ultrasound printed right on the front, adorned with a bright header that read, "A new family member arriving soon." Taking a deep breath to curb my growing fury, I tried calling my parents, but there was no answer. I spent the day mentally scripting various confrontations, ranging from calmly inquiring about it to outright accusations of betrayal. That night, I finally got through to them. My mom answered, and before I could accuse them of turning my announcement into a spectacle, she started crying. Between her sobs and my escalating anger, she managed to spill out words that weren't what I expected. We thought you should know. You're not our only child." Puzzled, I sat in silence as she continued, "The ultrasound, darling. It's." My dad chimed in through tears. "It's at Win. We didn't know how to tell you." The room spun around me. It was a joke, it had to be. Guess my act of denying reality wasn't going to save me here. Apparently, the photo they'd used for their card wasn't the same one I'd given them after all. Their grand announcement had accidentally unveiled a hidden chapter in our family history, one I never imagined existed. When I demanded answers, the full story unraveled messily. My mom and dad had become tangled in a decade-old biological conspiracy, fueled by foolishly desperate desires. They divulged how, long ago, during a challenging phase in their marriage, they participated in a rather secretive, ethically questionable fertility program which produced embryos that had been lost and forgotten, or so they thought. They'd signed away their rights under the guise of giving those creations a chance at life, buried it in their minds, thinking it was a decision they'd never confront. Until, apparently, the clinic tracked them down just as I was pregnant, distributing their old embryos for today's technology trends, anonymously seeking surrogates and donors who unknowingly bore related children. Somehow, one of these ultrasounds, the ultrasound they mistook for mine, was actually of something far more complex, the ghost of family ties in a womb unknown. I was a living biological sibling to unnamed other siblings who had been, through some bizarre consequence of scientific playing God, reborn elsewhere. As the horrific truth sank in, my trust in all family ties eroded. My parents explained how they assumed the photo they'd received was my own, foolishly enshrining their delusion in festive glory without even confirming. They, in the bubbling excitement of unaccustomed grandparenthood anticipation, sought to extend love to whatever form our family took, not realizing the minefield they were stepping into. Disturbed yet unable to fully digest this new reality, I ended the call, numbed by confusion. The ultrasound, supposedly of my child, haunted me, layered now with daunting implications. I felt my identity fragment, and questioned the very constructs of my existence, all because of a cheerful Christmas card that set off a horror sequence of parental transparency once thought unimaginable. Suddenly, every Christmas for me would carry not just the normal stresses of the holiday but the anchored weight of this revelation, a dark legacy interrupted not by joy, but by bizarre scientific intersections and unintended consequences. I lay there into the early hours, sleep evading me, the ghostly grainy images of ultrasound swirling in my mind, signifying more than I had prepared for, dreading the new responsibilities of piecing together this shattered illusion of familial understanding. As I sit here, weeks later, clutching the real ultrasound of my very real and singular pregnancy, I question, am I the asshole for feeling betrayed, furious over something they couldn't have predicted, or for wanting to claw back the autonomy stolen from this deeply personal moment? Am I the monster for avoiding them, for seeking solace in solitude to reconcile the anxieties of kinship and science gone wrong? The Christmas card, that damned harbinger of truths I never saw, still languishes on my desk, a morbid memento I can't bear to look at, yet can't seem to dispose of. Our family is irrevocably altered, trapped in a web woven from genetic threads and holiday cheer, its legacy and echo I fear will ominously pulsate long past the season's end, lingering much like its repercussions in our bloodline's eternity. Our town, secluded by thick forests and shielded by jagged mountains, was never the sort of place you stumbled upon by accident. It was a close-knit community where everyone knew each other, where whispers of a birth or a funeral swiftly became public knowledge, shared between aisles in our solitary grocery store or across pews at Sunday church service. That's why it became all the more unnerving when they first appeared, unwanted visitors who never walked into the store, never spoke to us, unraveling an eerie presence by simply watching. We noticed them perched on low roofs, lurking under the eaves, or standing at the edges of our fields, their dark silhouettes blending into the twilight. There was something unnaturally calm about their poses, their faces always dimly lit by the glow from a street lamp or slanting moonlight. They would watch everything, from our children's clumsy soccer games to intimate family dinners glimpsed through undrawn curtains. Their eyes never wavered, tracing every step with a curiosity that felt predatory. At first, we tried to ignore them, laughing off their presence as a quirk of local teenagers, or perhaps drifters passing through. But then bizarre events began to unravel. A dog found lifeless near the road with no signs of injury, an elderly couple waking to find all their doors unlocked despite the deadbolt's clicks echoing in their memory. Things only got worse when my neighbor, Alice, a retired schoolteacher, claimed loudly at the town meeting that she had seen one of them up close, their face pale and eyes reflecting a deep emptiness like a black mirror. She described how she had felt her thoughts unravel, a déjà vu that rattled her until she found herself standing in her living room, hours lost, her cat hissing in the corner. The authorities were not much help, the sheriff contending it was all another migraine-induced nightmare, despite how our fear flickered into desperation. Swapping stories under the flickering street lamps, we found a pattern. The visitors, as we grudgingly called them, seemed drawn to places of memory, spots where our strongest emotions resided. That's what led Ethan, a local teen, to his unfathomable curiosity. He suggested they thrived on emotions, feeding off them like parasites. The thought sent chills skittering down my spine, especially after I found my husband standing at the kitchen sink, staring blankly into the backyard where one of them stood, his face terrifyingly serene despite the steam from the boiling pot burning his skin. On the night Ethan disappeared, a storm racked our town, raindrops blurring our windows. Lightning revealed their outlines clustered around the school, their numbers unnaturally multiplied. It felt as though they had finally found their feast. Panic prickled our minds, but leaving was unthinkable. as many had cars that refused to start, and others found the roads had become indistinguishable marshes. In a storm-soaked frenzy, we decided to confront them, emboldened by anger and helplessness, marching towards the school where they watched undaunted, their impervious eyes reflecting our desperation. But as we drew closer, their edges blurred and faded into the downpour, dissolving like chalk drawings washed away. We searched the school grounds, calling out Ethan's name amidst the thunder's rumble, but found nothing except his rain-drenched backpack near the swings. That was the last night they watched us, the town enveloped in a tense quietness afterward as if holding its breath. Life resumed, but a sense of mortality lingered, forever haunted by the memory of their vigil. To outsiders, our town remains as peaceful as ever, but for us, it is a quiet facade marred by an aching void, a hollow left by the visitors who took with them a piece of what made us human. The autumn leaves crunched under my feet as I stood in front of the dusty, old mansion that once belonged to my family, the place where my brother Jason and I spent countless childhood summers, but now it was a decaying shell, haunted not just by memories but by something darker. You see, Jason was always the golden boy, smart, charming, and, despite my efforts to connect, utterly aloof. I had watched, helplessly, as he spiraled down the rabbit hole of addiction, desperate to escape the crushing weight of life's demands, eventually losing everything, his job, friends, our parents' trust, until he was just a shadow of the boy I once admired. I tried to save him, I really did, pouring my heart into trying to reason with him, but the drugs had tethered him to a nightmare I couldn't penetrate, and doctors whispered of rehab like it was some magical fix, while I felt something festering deep in my soul, something dark and primal whispering that maybe all this suffering had a purpose. On the night of his final overdose, I was at my wit's end, staring at his frail body, the once bright spark in his eyes reduced to nothing more than a lifeless void, and as I called 911, a flicker of something sinister ignited within me. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, the only way to truly help him was to drag his soul out of this earthly torment and send it to a hell far worse than anything I could imagine, a hell designed for souls like his, lost and hollow, addicted and craving the oblivion that only a darker world could provide. The hallucinations had started afterwards, strange voices whispering my name, calling me a savior, twisting my conscience into something unrecognizable, until I stumbled upon a tattered grimoire hidden in the attic. Searching for a way to help my brother had somehow pulled me toward this dark tome penned in ancient runes and hopeful desperation. With trembling fingers, I traced the words that promised to free souls from their earthly binds and send them to a place where they could confront their demons. Not that I was naive enough to believe in salvation, it was clear that something darker lurked beneath my resolve, but as I chanted the incantations, under the ghostly glow of the full moon, I felt power coursing through me, and for the first time, I believed I could help him. The rituals felt like a fever dream, a dance of shadows beneath the moonlight, and when I finally made my way to the rotting room where Jason lay, something in me shifted. I could feel the air crackle with electricity and despair, and I knew I had to make the hardest choice of my life. As I hovered over him, I whispered the final words, feeling the heat radiate from his body as if his very essence was being pulled from him. The fear in his eyes morphed into confusion, then anguish, and as I peered into the abyss, I heard his voice, a pitiful scream melding with the darkness that enveloped him. The room went cold as reality. Warped, stripping my brother of flesh and burden, unleashing him into a void where the shadows promised to teach him the lesson I could never impart. My heart raced, fueled by both guilt and resolve, and when the air settled, the silence felt deafening. I stood alone, forever marked by the choice I had made, grappling with the whispering assurance that I had finally set him free. But the relief didn't last long. By morning, the house was still engulfed in a heavy silence, thick like fog, and I realized I was no longer alone. The weight of Jason's absence wrapped around me, suffocating and palpable, a constant reminder of my sins. I thought I had done the right thing, but as the days turned into weeks, darkness seeped into my mind. I wasn't just haunted by the remorse of losing my brother, I was haunted by the things I had unleashed. The darkness that I believed could help him began to feast on my very soul. Every creak of the house became a whisper laced with mockery, his laughter twisted into something sinister, his form sometimes flickering in the corner of my eye, taunting me for thinking I had saved him, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I'd acted out of love, the shadows grew stronger, vowing that Jason's fate was irrevocable. I feared sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I plunged back into that nightmarish realm where I'd sent his soul, but instead of anguish, there was only a calm acceptance in the darkness, and I knew that my love had chained him to something far worse than the world I sought to save him from. Each night felt like a descent into madness as the boundaries blurred between reality and the nightmares I had crafted. I could almost hear his voice calling my name, a soft echo filled with betrayal, and with every heartbeat, the house seemed to pulse in rhythm with my rising dread, whispering what I had always tried to deny: I hadn't saved him, I had merely condemned us both. Now, weeks later, when I dare venture into a corner of the old mansion that still reeks of memories and regrets, I catch flickers of movement, a shadow darting just beyond my reach, the echo of a laugh, chillingly sweet yet profoundly heart-wrenching. His face, once angelic, now twisted by the darkness I had unleashed, fills my dreams with torment. I realized too late that I had sent my brother to hell for his own good, and now, every night, he visits me in my sleep, dragging me closer to the brink, calling me deeper into the shadows, begging for release and demanding that I join him in the depths from which he may never escape. I remember the night distinctly, cold air with that peculiar metallic scent that cuts the nose, reminding you you're alive. 5 years of abstinence had meant something until that moment. I was parked by the vacant lot where nothing of note usually happened, a forgotten corner of our small town everyone else seemed content to forget. The silence of the night was comforting, a far cry from the chaos within my mind. 5 years had slipped by since I first pledged to cleanse my soul from the burdens of my past. 5 years of avoiding that dark pit of memories lurking just beneath my smile. It wasn't easy, you know. Demons don't just vanish, they lurk, biding their time. They wait, patient, until you drop your guard. That night, I was perilously unarmed. I shouldn't have been driving down Old Mill Road at that hour, but there was a pull, a whisper I couldn't ignore. Ironic, considering how much I had worked on ignoring those siren calls. Parking under the dim glow of a battered street lamp, I fumbled nervously with the lighter in my pocket, flipping it open and closed in an unsteady rhythm, a metronome for the madness in my head. The object of my abstinence hadn't been drugs or alcohol, but rather something deeper, something darker that clawed at the essence of my very being. In a trembling voice I can barely identify as my own, I began to murmur my confession to the emptiness around, spilling words into the night air as though trying to exorcise a malignant entity hidden within. You see, it was never about changing the world, it was always about protecting myself from it. My descent into that hellish abyss began the day I dared pry into the forbidden crannies of the human psyche, a junkie's curiosity of the mind if you will, a sick need to unravel hidden truths best left in shadow. 5 years ago, I dabbled in what should never be dabbled with, an ancient, cursed text I found at a convention, a moment of weakness culminating in catastrophic regret. It promised insight, enlightenment, but all it gave was possession, like a festering wound that worsened the more I picked at it. With time's passing, I bottled the unholy rage within and devoted myself to abstinence, purging my soul through monotonous routines and synthetic smiles. Until now. It was this cursed Eve that drew me back. That book, its presence was too strong, it invaded my thoughts like a parasite, demanding attention, demanding obedience. And in a lapse of will I dared revisit it for closure, for an understanding I thought was attainable, and alas, I let go of 5 years of self-preservation. Yet the cruel twist of fate had its fangs buried deep. The text this time was different, rewritten or somehow transformed, as if mocking my pitiful resistance. Syllables I once deciphered with painstaking precision now leapt off the pages with cruel ease, each one etching onto my mind with a permanence I loathed yet could not escape. The whispered truths were lies, or perhaps truths too grotesque to bear. I felt hollowed out, an echo chamber for ancient sorrow. And yet, in those dreadful moments, there emerged clarity with a terrible price, a vision of intricate horrors threading through reality unseen by the naive eye. Picture this, humanity suspended by the thinnest of threads above an abyss, each strand woven from lives and stories repeating ad infinitum, a cycle unbroken save for moments of sheer truth breaching the surface of this mundane sea. For 5 long years, my abstinence had pushed me ever closer to the edge unwittingly, hemming me into this eventual return to despair. And now, the veil was lifted, the true scope of our fragility laid bare. Knowledge devoured from within just as it haunted my every waking hour. What had I exchanged my abstinence for? Nothing but an access to visions no sane mind would willingly endure. I had traded sobriety for the knowledge of harrowing inevitability, a fool's bargain, a cruel jest by entities far beyond our atrophied understanding. As I slammed the book shut, panting as though emerging from underwater, I felt the weight of those lost years pressing against me like a phantom limb. Shadows danced around the periphery of my vision, mocking my hubris, and yet sympathizing with my plight. They knew of the futility in my revelation. Wisdom brought pain, brought paralysis amidst the false hope of progress. There was no going back now. The abstinence was merely an illusion, a self-imposed exile from truths that could not be escaped. I sat there in the dim glow of streetlight, understanding at last that the only true abstinence was ignorance, and that had been shattered irrevocably. So here I am, confessing not for redemption, but to warn you of the futility in chasing truths unspeakable, in thinking that knowledge will bring peace, when it may only pave the way for ruin. I have wasted not just years, but my very being, and as the shadows draw near, I realize I must embrace the abyss I had so long attempted to ignore. I never thought I'd hear from Sarah again. It had been 3 years since our messy breakup, one where she had stormed out of my life, leaving only a cryptic voicemail that felt more like a threat than a farewell. So, when I saw her name flash on my phone one dull afternoon, my heart did a somersault, the way it used to when we were intimately entwined, making promises we both knew we could never keep. I hesitated, a flood of memories crashing over me, but the curiosity won out. I answered. "Hello?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's me," she replied, her tone eerily calm, void of the storming emotions I'd expected. It felt too measured, too rehearsed. "Can we talk?" I should have said no, should have hurled my phone against the wall, but instead, I swallowed hard and nodded to the air as if she could see me, agreeing to meet in that old cafe we used to haunt. My gut twisted with premonition as I arrived, the creaky table in the dim light bringing back both the warmth and the darkness of those coffee-fueled conversations. She was already there, her dark hair longer now, cascading over her shoulders like a curtain hiding a chaotic world behind it. "You look well," I managed to say, the awkward silence thickening our surroundings. "Thanks," she replied, but there was a certain vacancy behind her smile that caught me off guard. We exchanged pleasantries, small talk that felt wickedly false, but then she leaned closer, her voice dropping into secrecy. "I need to tell you something. It's about what happened that day." My blood ran cold. That day, the day she left, was a haze of anger, hurt, and confusion, yet an electric thrill of anxiety jolted through me as if I were the one sitting in the electric chair of memories. She took a deep breath, her fists curling together on the table, and I felt a rush of adrenaline. "I never wanted to leave, you know. I had to. There was something I couldn't explain." The weight of her words was heavy as they dangled between us like a fleeting ghost, and it became hard to breathe. "What do you mean?" I leaned in, my heart racing. Her eyes darted to the crowded cafe, as if searching for something or someone in the throng of oblivious patrons sipping their coffees. "You don't remember, do you? What we found in the woods?" The casual mention of those woods sent chills across my skin. Memories of that strange Saturday flooded back. The day we stumbled upon a desolate cabin while hiking, filled with unsettling trinkets and a thick, musty air that clung to us as we left. "I thought it was just some old folklore," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "But you said you saw something, Sarah. You said you saw something in the window." For a brief instant, shadows clung to her features, and the lightness of our past faded as she murmured, "I saw you." My blood went icy as I processed the admission. "What do you mean? It wasn't just a coincidence. You've always been different, haven't you? The way you feel when things get tense, the shadow that creeps into your eyes when you're too focused. It's why I had to leave." She paused, drawing a shaky breath, eyes wide but seemingly lost in another world. "You were connected to that thing in the woods. I thought I could ignore it, but it followed me. All these years, it..." She hesitated as if struggling to form a link to her frayed narrative. "It was in my thoughts, in my dreams, but now it's angry. When I try to sleep, it whispers to me. It wants out." My heart thundered in my chest, a primal instinct welled within. "What do you mean, it wants out?" I asked cautiously, amped up on adrenaline and dread. She looked around again, and this time, she didn't hide the fear etched into her expression. "It only shows itself when you remember." At that moment, the flickering of overhead lights gave me pause. The whole cafe grew dimmer as people around us went still, as if in synchronized dismay. I tried to shake it off, when suddenly Sarah's gaze lashed to a spot directly behind me, her breath hitching. "It's here, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice quaking with terror. I turned, the hairs on my neck prickling with dread. Nothing but empty chairs and marauding shadows behind me, and yet I could feel it pressing close, feel the silence like a weighted blanket. What do I do? I felt paralyzed, not just from fear but from the visceral connection to Sarah, memories flooding back too vividly. "You have to remember," she urged, her hand gripping mine tightly, "you have to help me." Just as the chairs began to rattle and the air thickened with unrest, a voice whispered from the depths of my mind, and in that split second, images flickered, that cabin, the fractured mirror inside, and that moment, The moment when I saw my reflection but not my own eyes. They were black as pitch, swirling like endless vacuum, a void looking back at me. Horror gripped my heart, and I knew then what she meant. The thing, it's inside me, isn't it? The truth clawed its way out as I realized the connection between us wasn't just love, but something darker. It had spread like vine through our lives, and now we were ensnared together in the rippling aftermath of our choices. "We're cursed," I murmured, the revelation dawning heavy on my soul. She nodded, tears shimmering like glass as they left trails down her cheeks. "We have to break it, together." "But how?" I choked out, as frantic energy pulsed in the air around us, a restless sanity weaving itself into the fabric of our reunion. I could feel it now, the intertwined fates that twisted us into a labyrinth, all stemming from that day. "I don't know, but we'll figure it out," she said, her voice gaining strength. Just as desperation gripped us anew, a shadow flitted across my peripheral vision, a dark figure standing just outside the cafe window, watching us. Panic ensued in my mind, fragments of faded memories igniting into a vivid frenzy. I squeezed her hand tighter, determination rising in a rush, but what lay ahead felt insurmountable. The cafe erupted in chaos, the patrons screaming, eyes glued to the darkness at the window, yet all I could think of was how the love we shared spiraled us into this madness. As I looked into her eyes, I realized she was right, the darkness craved our memories, it lived for them. But we couldn't roll our eyes and sleep anymore, we had to confront it together, even if it meant facing not just the shadows of our past, but also the horror of what we had become. "Let's do this," I said, steeling my resolve, but deep down, a chilling voice whispered, perhaps it was already too late. The reality of our fates was already stitched into the world that had witnessed us. Our ex-love didn't just want to talk, it demanded a reckoning. Sometimes, the simplest actions reverberate in the darkest ways, leaving us entangled in consequences we never foresaw. It all started when I moved into a nondescript apartment building in a quiet neighborhood. Everything seemed typical on the surface: late-night cat yowls, the occasional shout of a couple arguing from across the hall, and the faint, comforting aroma of someone's dinner wafting through the ventilation. But there was one thing that stood out: my neighbor across the hall, an older gentleman named Mr. Kulik. He was mysterious and rarely spoken to, his shy presence only justified by muted nods or a quick, reserved smile when we crossed paths. One evening, an unfamiliar young man, sweating and slightly panicked, knocked on my door. His name was Josh, and he was apparently Mr. Kulik's nephew. "I need your help," he blurted, wringing his hands into intertwined knots. He explained, with no small amount of frustration, that he had traveled from out of state to handle some of his uncle's affairs. He had just bought a large, high-definition TV for Mr. Kulik to keep him company during the nights. But as he was moving it up the stairs to his uncle's apartment, he had a slip due to the unbearable corridor heat and lack of any semblance of air conditioning, leaving him at the top of the staircase lined with flickering lights, dangerously close to sending the heavy box plummeting. He gestured desperately, seeking my assistance to secure it until he could reposition it safely. I hesitated for a moment, perhaps it was the gut feeling, or maybe it was absurdly justifiable selfishness, given that I was irritated from being unexpectedly disturbed. Nonetheless, the request was simple: "Just hold on for a second," he had said. I nodded, but just as I reached for the box, something peculiar happened. Mr. Kulik's door cracked open before swinging inward silently as if an unseen force pulled it. In the shadows stood Mr. Kulik himself, watching with an expression that was neither a smile nor a scowl, a depthless, calculating gaze. Josh seemed unnerved by his uncle's unexpected appearance, and in that moment of tense uncertainty, my hand grazed the box but never truly settled upon it. My hesitation was perhaps imperceptible to Josh, believing I was surely holding on securely, but the briefest falter on his part, assisted by our slick palms under the humid air, caused the handle to slip from his fingers. The world seemed to tilt as everything went into grim slow motion. The television twisted and spiraled, tumbling down the stairs with sickening, inevitable force, each somersaulting crash echoing our stunned silence, the fragile screen giving way to a horrendous, final shattering jolt. Josh stood frozen, mouth agape in disbelief at the ruin below. In that moment, it wasn't the shattered screen nor the unsettling echo of the destruction that felt chilling but Mr. Kulik's calm, slight smile before he retreated, fading back into the shadows of his apartment, leaving his door slightly ajar. "I told him I would buy him a new one if it broke," Josh explained, more to himself than to me, a mantra laced with a bewildering mixture of dread and forced resolve. His next words came with an unexpected, somber weight. "This wasn't supposed to happen, not this place, this curse." I pressed him for clarity, the term rattling like a jigsaw piece not from our puzzle, but he shook his head, clearly reluctant to delve deeper. Josh's unease seeped into my conscience, and that night I slept little, haunted by the day's events and the bizarre tapestry woven from an old man's stare, a young man's despair, and a simple, damning action of hesitation. Days drifted by uneventfully, as if time sought to whisk the incident into the recesses of mundane existence. Until, that is, odd things started happening. Shadows seemed to linger in corners where none should form, a persistent chill bristled unseen in the hallway, and strange noises, scratches and muted whispers, seeped through the walls at night. It felt like the building was breathing, alive with some ancient, waiting anticipation. I learned, through cautious whispers over cold coffee with my other neighbors, that several tenants had experienced similar unsettling phenomena upon interactions with Mr. Kulik. Little acts of reluctance or distrust, each dragging in its wake, an invisible thread binding them to inexplicable events. It was said his presence alone suckled upon some deep-rooted superstition, nourishing an unsettling aura confined within those walls. Whether it was truth or elaborate fiction crafted by the idle tongues of neighbors yearning for gossip, I knew this curse, or whatever archaic malediction that hid beneath melodramatic folklore, seemed intricately tied to hesitation born from well-meaning yet treacherous actions. As days morphed into weeks, I would catch brief glimpses of Josh, pale, gaunt, his visits less frequent, each punctuated with apologies to no one in particular on behalf of Mr. Kulik. He said little, far too absorbed in something unknowable. They say a curse feeds on intention, a harvest from the indecisive sands of reluctance, and as irrational fear wrapped its tendrils around my faithless mind, I pondered, was I the architect of our collective grief, channeling some ancient punishment fueled not by transgression, but by the mind's vulnerable frailty in moments that demanded certainty? This question hung ominous and heavy, an invisible lodestone searing its weight upon my every thought. I tried to confront Mr. Kulik once, an act of desperate courage, but his apartment lay empty, curiously untouched and undisturbed, as though its walls cared not to bear witness to human shortage or testament. I went to bed that night accompanied by unrest and the undeniable sense of being watched, as if unseen eyes traced my every movement through void. The building itself seemed to hum, a languid vigil threading through stucco cracks like veins. This was not merely Mr. Kulik's doing, this was something larger, something born from the core of uncertainty we all nurtured inadvertently. In the dark heart of that quiet neighborhood building, I learned that the loudest screams are silent, the most chilling gestures are unseen, and hesitation is a beast lurking in the folds of mundanity, ever ready to pounce at our moments of fragile indecision. When I first started my internship at the local mental health clinic, I had no idea that my career would lead me to a patient like her, a name I can't disclose due to HIPAA, but let me tell you, it doesn't matter what I call her, I'll never forget her. It was a drizzly Tuesday when I first visited her, a timid woman who had been referred to our clinic by a concerned neighbor who cited unusual behavior. I arrived at her house, only to find it was a dilapidated old Victorian at the end of a long, unpaved road. The wind howled through the crumbling shutters, giving the impression that the house itself was trying to shout a warning. I knocked, the sound echoing louder than I expected. There was a shuffling behind the door, and a moment later, it creaked open just enough for me to see a sliver of her face, framed by unkempt hair and bloodshot eyes. You came," she muttered in a hushed tone before reluctantly letting me in. The interior was dimly lit and smelled musty, with peeling wallpaper and dusty furniture barely holding on to the remnants of its former glory. I glanced towards the staircase leading to the upper levels, but it was barricaded by a rusted gate, and that's when I noticed a door to the right, its edges warped as if it had been poorly fitted. Curiosity nodded me as I caught her stealing glances at it while fidgeting with her fingers, nails bitten down to the quick. It was through our conversation that I learned she lived alone in the basement. "It's better down there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "they can't hear me." I was instantly intrigued. I asked who they were, but she only shook her head, tears pooling in her sunken eyes. I tried to delve deeper into her story, but she withdrew, as if placing a fragile veil around her truth, isolating herself even further. Determined to break through her barriers, on my next visit I asked about the basement, and she bit her lip, hesitating before saying it was safer, warmer, more hidden. I can't let them find me." Her words sent chills down my spine, but I reminded myself that it was a classic case of paranoia, a symptom often present in patients dealing with severe anxiety or schizophrenia. Yet, every detail, every shadowy glance towards that door in the living room clawed at my professional mind. After a few more appointments, I broke down my own resolve and proposed visiting the basement. "You could feel more comfortable down there. "Let's talk in your safe space," I suggested, swallowing the unease creeping up my throat. Reluctantly, she agreed. The moment we descended the rickety stairs, I felt the air grow heavy, thick with the stale scent of dampness and mildew. The basement was cavernous and dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a flickering light bulb hanging from the low ceiling, casting eerie shadows that danced on the concrete walls. In the far corner, I saw her makeshift bed, a tattered mattress strewn with stained blankets and discarded books. The walls were pinned with pages torn from magazines, all with frantic, manic scrawls in red ink outlining her fears and conspiracies, connecting dots that led nowhere. It was chaotic, a frantic map of a mind grasping at the last straws of sanity. My heart raced as she started to explain her thoughts, but I felt like I was being watched. A prickle of anxiety crawled up my spine. "They know," she whispered, eyes wide with dread. But before I could question her further, I heard it, a faint scratching noise originating from behind the wall, like nails digging into wood. My pulse quickened, and I glanced at her, expecting to see fear mirrored in her gaze, but instead, there was an unsettling calmness. "They're here," she said as if it were an everyday occurrence, her voice chillingly nonchalant. "They come during the night when I can't see them. I can hear them scratching. Want to come in?" I felt my throat tighten, a tight coil of panic unfurling in my stomach as I tried to rationalize. "It's probably just the pipes or the house settling," I attempted to soothe her, but doubt gnawed at my certainty. Then, without warning, she surged to her feet and banged her fists against the wall where the sound was emanating from, demanding, "Leave me alone. I'm not afraid of you." Anguish flooded her face, and for a moment, I forgot everything I thought I knew about her until the scratching turned into a sudden thundering knock on the other side of the wall. I stumbled back, the world tilting as panic clawed at my chest. I had to remind myself that this was a woman in pain, someone who was manifesting her paranoia through this madness, yet the absolutely bewildering fear spread through me like wildfire. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, and the knocking intensified, transforming into frantic thuds that echoed around us. "Please. Let me out. You can't stay here," she screamed, her voice a mix of terror and defiance. Forcing myself to remain calm, I took a step toward her, but she shrieked, "Don't. They'll see you." The weight of her words anchored me to the spot as shadows seemed to stretch, darkening the corners of the room as if they were swallowing the light whole. Then it all became too much, something primal within me triggered a fight or flight response, and I bolted back up the stairs, fueled by a terrifying urgency to escape that dark, suffocating basement. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me, only to find her crying softly, "You shouldn't have left." I didn't return to the clinic the next day, nor the week after that. I told myself it was for her sake as much as mine, she needed better care than I could provide. But truthfully, it was because I couldn't shake the bone-deep feeling that maybe, just maybe, she was right, that something in that basement wasn't just her paranoia. Days turned into weeks, and the memories of my encounters with her began to fade until, one afternoon, I saw an article online. It detailed a woman found dead in a basement, the walls plastered with strange markings and notes, her body curled beneath the stairs. The cause of death was unexplained, terrifying to think of her, alone and frightened, once again. I quickly clicked on the link and felt my stomach drop when I saw a picture of her, a familiar, hollow-eyed gaze that now stared vacantly back at me from the screen. Beneath it was a chilling quote from her neighbor stating how they heard scratching behind the walls every night she was there but assumed it was just rodents. The moment the article loaded, my phone buzzed, and I turned to see a message flash on the screen from my supervisor, "You're back." All the air whooshed out of my lungs as I read the text again. "We're getting a new patient to the clinic. You're on for the assessment. Lives in a basement." Minutes later, a familiar voice crackled down the line, a haunting echo of despair. "Please. Help me," it whispered, and suddenly I knew, I could never escape the basement. The night of my grandmother's funeral, I thought I would feel a sense of closure, a moment of bittersweet peace, but instead, as the last of the mourners trickled out, I felt a tightening in my chest, like hands gripping my heart, and it only intensified when I found myself alone in her old, creaking house. From the moment the door swung shut behind me, the air seemed to thicken with her absence, and I swear I heard whispers, barely audible, but certainly there, calling from the shadows time-worn with family secrets and ghostly echoes. I trekked through the house, memories cascading over me like the dust that danced in the fading sunlight. The smell of her lavender perfume lingered in the hallway, reminding me of the bedtime stories she used to tell, her voice a honeyed incantation that painted our family's lore. I found myself drawn to the attic, the space she told me never to explore unless she was around, The words mingled with undertones of fear that seemed to gnaw at my instincts. Against my better judgment, my hand reached for the doorknob, a flickering candle in my other hand casting jagged shadows that danced ominously across the wooden planks of the floor. As I yanked the door open, a rush of stale, cold air slammed into my face, bringing with it the intoxicating smell of mildew and something rotten. I clambered up the ladder, heart pounding, each step echoing like a countdown to something inevitable. The attic was cluttered with old furniture draped in moth-eaten sheets, boxes stacked haphazardly, some labeled in Grandma's delicate handwriting, but one corner caught my eye. Uncovered by its shroud, an ornate vintage mirror stood, its surface murky and cracked, like the remnants of a stormy sea. I took a cautious step closer, drawn in by its eerie charm, and as I peered into the depths of the glass, the faint whispers returned, hushed and urgent, "Don't make your mother angry." The words echoed against the stillness, and my heart rate spiked. I remembered Grandma's frail hands gripping mine in a desperate warning, blue eyes filled with fear as she whispered that there are things beneath the surface that no one should disturb, and now, they had awakened. I turned away, a chill creeping up my spine, convinced my imagination was playing tricks on me, until I heard the distinct shuffle of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. My breath caught, and my pulse thrummed in my ears as I spun around, to find the attic empty save for cobwebs and dust, but the smell of lavender wrapped around me, thick and suffocating, a gentle reminder of her presence, or maybe a threat. Just as a wave of uneasy resolve pushed me to leave, I locked eyes with the mirror once more, and this time, it was not my own reflection staring back. There was a figure standing behind me, cloaked in shadow, a ghostly woman with long dark hair and hollow eyes, the very image of my mother. "I told you not to disturb her," she hissed, voice laced with that same insidious silk as Grandma's final warning, and I could barely move as she raised a finger, pointing directly at me, the accusation palpable. "It's been too long, sweet child. You've kept her from us." The cold in the attic deepened, and I staggered back as whispers turned to shrieks, echoes of generations lost, each one carrying the weight of their rage. I stumbled backward, losing my footing, and the moment the mirror cracked, it felt like a dam bursting, the air around me spiraling into chaos. The phantom voices screamed in a deafening crescendo as the darkness folded in on itself, and I realized I was trapped in a snare of my own making. The memory of Grandma's hands around my wrist, the recounting of family tragedies, and the tales of what happened when you didn't heed the warnings, it all spiraled back in a whirlpool of dread as the shadows pressed closer, the air thick with scents of decay and betrayal. Frantically, I backed away, slamming into an old trunk that crashed to the floor, flinging it open just to escape the nightmare unfolding before me, expecting to find only dusty trinkets, but instead, my grandmother's voice pierced through the chaos, "Don't make your mother angry." Unraveling the remnants of her life, I found the sinister glint of something metallic, a family heirloom, a locket that had not seen the light of day in decades, and in that moment, understanding snapped into place. I had unleashed something unholy, a tether between worlds that craved blood, belonging to them, as much as it belonged to me. I thought of my mother, the bitterness that had seeped into her veins from a life of silence and half-truths. As the entities lunged from the mirror, I held the locket to my chest, shouting with every ounce of strength I could muster, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Hoping the shadows would recognize the plea, but the darkness smirked, gaping maws opening in laughter, my grandmother's voice resonating across time as the light flickered out, sealing my fate with just a few simple words hanging ominously in the suffocating air, "Now you'll never make her angry again."